From his penthouse high above Manhattan, Alexander Royce stood at the edge of a vast floor-to-ceiling window, the city's iconic skyline sprawling before him like a testament to his triumph. Below, the streets of New York bustled with life, energy, and ambition, qualities Alexander had once embodied in his relentless climb to power. Now, at the pinnacle of his success, he was the undisputed titan of the global hospitality industry. His name was synonymous with luxury, his empire stretching across continents, his vision redefined opulence. Every detail of his life was meticulously curated to reflect perfection. The penthouse, perched atop Royce Tower, was an architectural marvel, a mix of glass and steel that glistened under the city lights. Inside, it was a sanctuary of elegance. Rare marble floors, custom-designed chandeliers, and artwork worth millions adorned the walls. His collection of vintage scotches stood like sentinels on an ebony bar, their amber hues glowing faintly under the recessed lighting. Alexander's hotels were not just buildings, they were experiences, temples of indulgence for the world's elite. Celebrities, dignitaries, and moguls all sought the prestige of staying in a Royce suite, where every detail, from hand-woven carpets to menus curated by Michelin-starred chefs, was designed to pamper and impress. He was more than a businessman. He was an institution, the architect of dreams for those wealthy enough to afford them. Yet behind the glitz and grandeur lay a man shrouded in isolation. Alexander Royce, the king of hospitality, lived a life devoid of true connection. His marriage had ended years ago, dissolved under the weight of ambition and neglect. His daughter Sophie had drifted away, resentful of a father who had always prioritized boardrooms over birthday parties. His friends were no more than associates, and his conversations were little more than negotiations. Standing there, glass in hand, Alexander gazed down at the world he had conquered. But as the city pulsed with life, a question gnawed at the edges of his mind, one he refused to entertain for long. What do I have, beyond all of this? The doctor's office was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Alexander Royce sat across from Dr. Patterson, a man he had known for over a decade. This was supposed to be a routine checkup, an annual affair sandwiched between high-stakes meetings and grandiose launches. Alexander, ever the image of power and control, expected the usual, glowing health results and a few patronizing warnings to take it easy. Instead, the atmosphere was heavy. Dr. Patterson's hands rested tensely on the desk, his gaze steady but apologetic. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his piercing eyes narrowing. He was not accustomed to silence, especially not from those who worked for him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice clipped. Dr. Patterson hesitated for a moment before exhaling deeply. "Alexander, I'm afraid the results are not what we'd hoped for. The scans show advanced pancreatic cancer. It's already metastasized." The words hit like a freight train. Alexander's grip on the armrest tightened. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his tone carrying the sharp edge of disbelief. "I'm saying it's terminal," Dr. Patterson continued gently. "With aggressive treatment, you might have 6 months, maybe less." Alexander's world tilted. For a moment, he simply stared at the doctor, the words struggling to take root in his mind. Terminal. 6 months. Words meant for others, not for him. He had money, power, and access to the best medical minds in the world. Surely there was a solution. "That's impossible," he said, standing abruptly. "There's always an answer, a surgery, a drug, something experimental. You just need to find it." "Alexander," the doctor said carefully, "there's nothing we can do to reverse this." Fury surged through him. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound reverberating in the quiet room. "Nothing?" he spat. "Don't talk to me about nothing. I've built an empire from nothing." But as the doctor held his gaze, calm but resolute, Alexander realized he was facing an opponent he could not negotiate with, intimidate, or buy off. And for the first time in decades, he felt powerless. The grand ballroom of the Royce Tower was packed with reporters, cameras flashing like strobe lights. The air buzzed with anticipation as the man of the hour, Alexander Royce, stepped onto the stage. Clad in a tailored black suit, he exuded his signature authority, but those who knew him well would notice the faint tension in his jaw, the shadow in his eyes. He adjusted the microphone, his voice calm but forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've gathered you here for a matter of utmost urgency. I have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say I have 6 months to live. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a flurry of whispered speculations. Alexander raised a hand to silence them. But I refuse to accept that timeline. To anyone, any doctor, researcher, or institution who can cure me, I offer everything. My fortune, my empire, all of it. The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other, the chaos reflecting the disbelief and greed sparked by his announcement. Alexander's declaration made global headlines within hours, igniting a frenzy of proposals from opportunists and experts alike. Days later, amidst the media storm, a letter appeared in the press, penned by the renowned oncologist Dr. Henry Wallace. Mr. Royce, money may buy many things, but it cannot buy time. Your wealth will not save you. What you truly need is to find meaning in the time you have left. The words cut deeper than the diagnosis itself. For the first time, Alexander Royce faced a challenge his fortune could not solve. The streets of New York were a world Alexander Royce rarely stepped into. His empire existed above it, rising high into the glittering skyline. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he walked. With his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat, he drifted from the opulent streets of Times Square to the weathered sidewalks of Harlem. The city was alive with contrasts. The neon lights of Broadway cast their garish glow on tourists snapping photos and theatergoers bustling to catch their shows. But as Alexander wandered farther north, the glitter faded into a muted rhythm of streetlights and darkened storefronts. The smell of food carts gave way to the acrid tang of garbage, and the polished marble facades dissolved into cracked brick walls. Turning a corner, he came upon a small diner, its fluorescent light flickering weakly through the grime-streaked windows. Inside, he saw a family seated at a corner booth, a man in a grease-stained jacket, a woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, and 2 young children. They passed a single plate of fries among them, laughing and talking as though the world outside didn't matter. Alexander stopped, his gaze fixed on them. The father ruffled the hair of his youngest daughter, who squealed with delight. The mother, despite the exhaustion in her expression, leaned in to kiss her husband on the cheek, her smile radiating warmth. He couldn't look away. The scene felt alien, yet familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. He realized with a pang of discomfort that he envied them. This family, with nothing but a shared plate of food, seemed to possess a wealth he had never known. Connection, love, joy found in the smallest moments. Alexander's chest tightened. He thought of his own family, of Sophie, his daughter, whose face he hadn't seen in years. He thought of her smile, once so bright, now a distant echo in his memory. He turned away from the diner, his steps heavier than before, the laughter of the family lingering in his ears. For the first time in decades, Alexander Royce felt the weight of a life lived without meaning. The rhythmic clatter of the subway train echoed through the platform as Alexander Royce descended the stairs into the underbelly of New York City. The air was thick with the scent of metal and grime, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed halls of his luxurious hotels. Yet, among the chaos, a hauntingly beautiful melody drifted through the tunnels. Following the sound, Alexander found a man playing a battered violin near the far end of the platform. The musician, his clothes frayed and his face weathered by time, played with an intensity that belied his appearance. Each note carried a raw emotion, filling the air with a poignant sadness that silenced the usual noise of the subway. Alexander stood in the shadows, captivated. People walked past without a second glance, some tossing loose change into the violin case at the musician's feet. But the man played on, his eyes closed, lost in the music as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. A small boy, no older than 8, stopped in front of the musician. His clothes were patched and his sneakers worn thin. From his pocket, the boy pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. He hesitated, looking at the bill, then at the musician. With a shy smile, he dropped the money into the violin case. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice barely audible over the melody. The musician opened his eyes, his face breaking into a smile that was equal parts gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, young man," he said softly, nodding. Alexander felt his throat tighten. He watched as the boy, who clearly had so little, gave away what might have been all he had. The selflessness of the act struck him like a blow. This child, with holes in his shoes, had given more freely than Alexander ever had in his life. As the train pulled into the station, Alexander turned away, his heart heavy with a realization that unsettled him deeply. Wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the willingness to give. The streets of the Lower East Side were quieter now, the hum of the city dulled under the weight of night. Alexander Royce wandered aimlessly, his mind clouded with thoughts he couldn't quite untangle. He turned a corner and came across a small figure crouched on the sidewalk. A flickering street lamp illuminated her, a girl, no older than 10, with wild curls peeking out from under a knitted hat too large for her head. She sat cross-legged on the pavement, surrounded by scraps of paper and a box of worn-out crayons. In front of her was a small wooden sign, the letters hand-drawn and uneven. Paintings for sale, $5 each. Curious, Alexander approached. The girl didn't look up at first, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she carefully shaded in a sunbeam on her latest drawing. It was a crude but colorful depiction of the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset. Across the bottom, she had written in looping script, "Find your own light." "How much for this one?" Alexander asked, his voice softer than he intended. The girl looked up, startled but not afraid. $5, she said quickly. "I can give you 2 for 10. Alexander chuckled, the sound foreign even to his own ears. "What does it mean?" he asked, pointing to the words on the picture. The girl tilted her head, considering. "It means, even if it's dark, you should try to make your own light, like the bridge does at night." Her answer was matter of fact, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. He pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and handed it to her. The girl's eyes widened, but before she could protest, he said, "I'll take this one. Keep the change." Walking away with the painting in hand, Alexander found himself staring at the words again and again. Find your own light. For the first time, he wondered, had he ever truly sought his own light, or had he merely chased the shine of wealth and power? The office was small, tucked away on the second floor of a quiet building in Brooklyn. Alexander Royce hesitated for a moment outside the frosted glass door. The name etched into the glass read, Linda Carter, Career Consulting. He had memorized it from the research his assistant had provided, but standing here now, the words felt heavier than they should. Taking a deep breath, Alexander pushed the door open. The soft chime of a bell announced his arrival, and Linda looked up from her desk. Her face was sharper than he remembered, her hair streaked with silver that hadn't been there the last time they'd spoken. Recognition flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by surprise, and then guardedness. "Mr. Royce," she said, her voice calm but clipped. "This is unexpected." Alexander stepped into the modest office, a far cry from the opulent boardrooms she used to share with him. "Hello, Linda," he began, his voice tinged with an uncharacteristic humility. "I owe you an apology." Linda leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "An apology? After all these years?" "What for, exactly?" "For how I treated you," Alexander admitted. "For dismissing you when you dared to disagree with me. You were loyal, and I repaid that loyalty with arrogance. I was wrong." She raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. What brings this sudden burst of introspection? A crisis of conscience? He hesitated. How could he explain it? The diagnosis, the wandering through the city, the moments that had cracked open the walls he had built around himself? "I've been given 6 months to live," he finally said. "And in that time, I want to do something meaningful. I want to fix the mistakes I've made." Linda's posture softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "And you think finding me is part of that?" "Yes," Alexander said simply. "I want you to help me build something that matters, a foundation, something to give back to the people I ignored for too long. I need someone I can trust." For a long moment, Linda didn't respond. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You're not the man I remember, Alexander," she said. "That man wouldn't have admitted he was wrong. Maybe this is worth giving a chance." He nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Linda." As she smiled faintly, Alexander realized this wasn't just about redemption. It was about trust, rebuilding it one step at a time. The small hotel on 34th Street had been a jewel once. Its brick facade still bore faint traces of grandeur, but the years had not been kind. The sign above the entrance now hung at an awkward angle, and the once pristine windows were streaked with grime. Alexander Royce stood across the street, studying the building that had once belonged to Michael Quinn, a man he had considered both rival and obstacle. Years ago, Alexander had used every tool at his disposal: loopholes, aggressive buyouts, and unrelenting pressure to acquire the property. For him, it had been a tactical victory, one that solidified his dominance in the Manhattan hotel scene. For Michael, it had been the death knell of a career built on passion rather than power. Taking a deep breath, Alexander stepped inside. The modest lobby had been stripped of its former luxury, now serving as a reception area for a small, struggling inn. Behind the counter stood Michael Quinn, his once proud frame slightly stooped, but his eyes as sharp as ever. When he looked up and saw Alexander, his expression hardened. "Royce," Michael said, his voice laced with decades of resentment. "What brings the king of hospitality to my doorstep? Need another hotel to crush?" Alexander winced but held his ground. "I came to make amends," he said simply. Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Amends? You took everything I worked for and left me with nothing. Why would I care about your amends?" "Because I was wrong," Alexander admitted, meeting Michael's gaze directly. "I took this place from you because I could, not because I needed it, and now I'm giving it back." Michael frowned, clearly taken aback. "Giving it back? What's the catch?" "No catch," Alexander said. "I'm converting it into a community shelter, a place for the homeless to find food, warmth, and safety. I want you to run it." Michael's laughter faded, replaced by suspicion. "And why would I do that?" "Because you care about this place," Alexander replied, "and because it needs someone who understands what it means to lose everything." For a long moment, Michael was silent, his gaze flicking between Alexander and the worn lobby around him. Finally, he nodded, though his tone was still cautious. "Fine, but on one condition. This place doesn't just become a shelter. It becomes a home for those who've been forgotten." Alexander extended his hand, and Michael hesitated before shaking it. As they stood there, the echoes of their rivalry faded, replaced by the first fragile threads of understanding. The biting wind of New York's winter swept through the streets, tugging at Alexander Royce's overcoat as he walked through Bowery. The once proud magnate found himself in a neighborhood he had rarely thought of, much less visited, in his former life. The area, known for its shelters and soup kitchens, seemed to pulse with a raw humanity that both unsettled and intrigued him. He spotted a familiar figure huddled under the overhang of a rundown building, a man wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes, a battered cardboard sign resting in front of him. "Hungry. Anything helps." His face was gaunt, marked by years of hardship, but Alexander recognized him immediately. It was David Green. Years ago, David had been a rising star in Alexander's hotel empire, compassionate manager who had once overseen one of the company's flagship properties. But David's downfall came during a brutal winter storm. Against company policy, he had opened the hotel's unused rooms to homeless families seeking refuge. When word reached Alexander, he fired David without a second thought, prioritizing profits over people. Alexander approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "David?" he called softly. The man looked up, squinting against the light. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as recognition dawned. "Royce?" he rasped. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I came to find you," Alexander said, kneeling to meet David's gaze. "I've been thinking about the choices I've made, and I realize I was wrong. About you, about that night, about everything." David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Too late for that now, don't you think?" "No," Alexander replied firmly. "It's not too late. You did what was right, and I punished you for it. Now I want to help you get back on your feet." David studied him, his eyes skeptical, but tinged with curiosity. "Why now? What's the catch?" Alexander sighed. "I don't have much time left. Cancer. 6 months, if I'm lucky. I'm trying to make things right. I've started a foundation to help people in need, and I want you to run it." David blinked, his mouth opening slightly in surprise. "You want me to run it?" "You're the best man for the job," Alexander said. "You understand what it means to give people a chance, because you've been there." For a long moment, David said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. "All right, Royce. If you're serious about this, I'll do it. But only if we make this about the people, not about you." Alexander smiled faintly. Agreed. Together, they stood and began walking, the cold wind biting less fiercely as a sense of purpose filled the space between them. The house in Long Island was modest, surrounded by a picket fence and a garden that had long since overgrown. Alexander Royce stood at the gate, his hand hesitating on the latch. It had been years since he last saw his daughter, Sophie. Their estrangement was his fault. He knew that now. He had chosen boardrooms over bedtime stories, deals over dance recitals. But now, with time slipping through his fingers, he had to try. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Moments later, Sophie appeared, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. She didn't invite him in. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone cold. Alexander took a deep breath. "I needed to see you. I don't have much time left, Sophie. Let me guess," she interrupted, crossing her arms. "You've suddenly decided to be a father because you're dying? That's rich." Her words stung, but Alexander didn't falter. "You're right to feel that way," he said quietly. "I wasn't there for you, and I regret it every single day. But I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want to explain." Reluctantly, Sophie stepped aside, letting him in. Over the next hour, Alexander shared everything: the diagnosis, his encounters with the people he had wronged, and his newfound purpose. He spoke not as the towering businessman she had known, but as a vulnerable man seeking redemption. Sophie's defenses softened. Her father, once untouchable and unyielding, now sat before her, raw and human. She saw sincerity in his eyes, a rare humility that chipped away at her bitterness. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," she said eventually, "but I think I'd like to try." Tears welled in Alexander's eyes as he nodded. "That's more than I deserve." In the weeks that followed, Sophie began to accompany her father on his charitable projects. Together, they worked side by side, creating a bond that had long been missing. Though their time was short, it was enough to heal the wounds of the past. The boardroom of Royce Enterprises had never been so silent. Alexander Royce stood at the head of the table, his gaze steady, as he addressed the room filled with executives and shareholders. This was his empire, the culmination of decades of relentless ambition. Yet today, he had come to dismantle it. "I've called this meeting to announce a decision that will likely shock all of you," Alexander began, his voice calm but resolute. "Effective immediately, I am selling the entire Royce chain of hotels." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, murmurs, and protests filled the air as his words settled over the room. The board members, all seasoned veterans of corporate politics, exchanged panicked glances. "Mr. Royce," one of the executives began, "surely you can't be serious. The Royce chain is worth billions. Selling it would." Alexander raised a hand, silencing the objections. "This isn't up for debate," he said firmly. "The proceeds from the sale will go into establishing a foundation, a charity that will provide for those who have been overlooked by society, children without homes, artists without means, families struggling to survive." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The man who had built an empire was now walking away from it, not for another fortune, but for something far more meaningful. In the months that followed, the Royce Foundation for Hope was born. The billions from the hotel sale were funneled into projects that touched every corner of New York. Alexander didn't just sign checks, he immersed himself in the work. His once pristine suits were replaced by jeans and work boots as he walked through construction sites, shaking hands with laborers and personally overseeing every detail. In Harlem, he helped break ground on a new playground, a place where children could play freely, away from the dangers of the streets. He smiled as he watched a group of kids chase each other around, their laughter echoing through the air. In the Bronx, he visited a shelter being built from the remnants of an old warehouse. The rooms, warm and inviting, were designed to give homeless families not just a place to sleep, but a sense of dignity. Alexander spoke to the families, listening to their stories and promising them a future of stability. At the Lower East Side, he funded a community art center where struggling artists could create without worrying about the costs of rent or supplies. He watched as a young painter unveiled her first mural, a vibrant, hopeful scene of people coming together. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt truly alive. His wealth, once a symbol of dominance, was now a tool for compassion. As he stood amidst the laughter of children, the gratitude of families, and the creative energy of artists, he realized he had finally found the light he had been searching for. The transformation of Alexander Royce's life wasn't just his own. It became a shared journey with those he had once wronged. People who had once been casualties of his ambition now stood beside him, their strength and resilience helping to shape the very foundation of his new mission. Linda Carter, a voice of strategy. At the helm of the Royce Foundation's strategic planning sat Linda Carter, his former assistant. Her sharp mind, once dismissed by Alexander, was now indispensable. Linda ensured that every dollar from the foundation was used effectively, focusing on creating sustainable programs rather than temporary solutions. The Linda Carter Women's Shelter became one of the flagship projects, a safe haven for women and children escaping abusive situations. "I told you I'd only help if this was real," Linda said to Alexander one evening, reviewing the progress reports. "And you've proven it is." Alexander nodded, his gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. Linda's belief in the mission gave it strength and structure, turning dreams into reality. Michael Quinn, a symbol of renewal. Michael Quinn, once a rival, now oversaw the Hope Haven Shelter, the former hotel on 34th Street that Alexander had returned to him. Under Michael's leadership, the building became a sanctuary for the homeless, providing not just beds, but counseling, job training, and education. During an opening ceremony, Michael addressed the crowd, his voice steady. "This place was once a battleground for pride and profit," he said. "Now it's a home, a place where people can rebuild their lives." Standing in the audience, Alexander felt a pang of humility. Michael's words reflected the transformation of not just the hotel, but also the man who had once taken it from him.
David Green, the heart of compassion. David Green,
the former manager Alexander had unjustly fired, became the director of the foundation's humanitarian projects. His personal experience of homelessness informed every decision he made, ensuring that dignity and humanity were at the core of every initiative. Under David's guidance, the Green Community Center opened in Bowery, offering meals, healthcare, and resources to those in need. "You gave me a chance to stand again," David told Alexander during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "Now, it's my turn to do the same for others." Each project bore the marks of Alexander's past mistakes and the lessons he had learned. The people he had wronged became his partners in redemption, shaping a legacy that was as much theirs as it was his. Together, they created something enduring, a testament to the power of reconciliation and the shared humanity that binds us all. The Brooklyn Bridge stood as a timeless symbol of New York's resilience and unity, and tonight its arches glowed under strings of soft golden lights. The hum of the city seemed to quiet as hundreds gathered for an unprecedented event, a charity exhibition hosted by Alexander Royce. The bridge was transformed into an open-air gallery. Easels displayed vibrant paintings created by children from the Community Art Center, their pieces brimming with hope and imagination. Nearby, musicians played heartfelt melodies, their tunes echoing against the steel cables. Stories of struggle and triumph were shared on banners, written in the voices of the very people Alexander's foundation had touched. Alexander stood at the center of it all, a quiet figure among the vibrant life he had helped foster. Sophie stood by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent but powerful symbol of their reconciliation. David Green mingled with families who had found shelter at his center. Linda Carter exchanged ideas with local leaders about expanding their projects. Michael Quinn helped guide visitors through the exhibits, his pride in their shared work evident. As the crowd gathered under the bridge's arches, Alexander stepped forward to speak. The microphone crackled softly as he adjusted it, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I once believed that life was about winning," he began, his words carrying over the hushed crowd, "about building something so tall, so vast, that it could never be taken away. But in chasing that dream, I lost sight of what really matters." He gestured to the exhibits around him. "These paintings, these songs, these stories, they are the real legacy of our city. They show us that even in our darkest moments, there is light to be found, that even when we fall, we can rise again." Alexander paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "I don't have much time left," he said, his voice softening. "But I've learned that time is not measured by the days we live, but by what we give. So I leave you with this: live to repair, to love, and to give. That is how we find meaning. That is how we build a better world." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of emotion washing over the bridge. As Alexander stepped back, he looked out at the city he had once tried to conquer. Tonight, for the first time, he felt truly at peace. The sun had just begun to rise over Brooklyn Bridge, casting golden light over the city. Alexander Royce had once sought to control and now learned to love. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of New York waking up. For Alexander, this place, once just a landmark, had become the heart of his redemption, a place where he found light amidst the darkness of his life. He sat on a simple wooden bench near the bridge's iconic arches, wrapped in a warm blanket. His breaths were shallow, each one an effort, but his eyes were clear and calm. Around him stood the people who had shared in his journey. Sophie, his daughter, held his hand tightly, her tears reflecting both grief and gratitude. Linda Carter stood nearby, her usual sharp demeanor softened with quiet respect. Michael Quinn and David Green flanked him, their presence a testament to the bridges he had mended in his final days. Alexander's voice was faint but steady as he whispered, "I didn't build this bridge, but it feels like mine now. It connects, just like we all should." Sophie pressed her forehead to his, her tears falling freely. "You did good, Dad," she said softly. "You made it right." A small smile crept onto his lips as he closed his eyes. His last breath was quiet, leaving the world with a serenity that had eluded him for most of his life. Around him, his family and friends remained silent, honoring the man who had finally found peace. The news of Alexander Royce's passing spread quickly, accompanied by stories of his transformation. He was no longer remembered as the ruthless billionaire who had dominated the hospitality industry, but as the man who had used his final days to build a foundation of hope. The Royce Foundation for Hope flourished, led by the very people who had shared in his journey. Linda Carter expanded its programs, creating new shelters for women and children across the country. Michael Quinn continued to transform forgotten buildings into thriving community hubs, offering dignity to the homeless. David Green's compassion drove the expansion of humanitarian aid, touching lives far beyond New York. Sophie, inspired by her father's transformation, took the helm of the foundation, ensuring that its mission lived on. Brooklyn Bridge became a symbol of Alexander's legacy. Every year, the city hosted an event in his honor, showcasing the art, music, and stories of the people his foundation had helped. At the center of the bridge, a small plaque read, "In memory of Alexander Royce, a man who found his light and shared it with the world, lived to repair, to love, and to give." And so, Alexander Royce's story became more than just a tale of redemption. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that it is never too late to change, to give, and to leave behind a legacy that truly matters. It is never too late to change, to love, and to give. Life is measured not by what we accumulate, but by the light we bring into the lives of others. Find your light and let it shine for the world to see. This is the essence of Alexander Royce's journey, a reminder that redemption, hope, and compassion can transform not only one life, but countless others. If you found Alexander Royce's journey inspiring, there's so much more to explore. Subscribe now to stay connected with stories of hope, redemption, and the incredible power of change. Together, let's discover what it means to truly live, love, and give. Hit that subscribe button and join us in sharing the light.